Hey there, this is Mr. Icarus, and welcome to yet another edition of Doom Mod Madness. This time round, we are checking out a mod by the name of Bloom. This is apparently what happens when you mix blood and Doom together. Not only do you get strange hybrid enemies, blending elements of both the Doom bestiary and the blood bestiary, but you also get this wonderfully strange collision of realities. One moment you'll be going down a familiar Doom map hallway, only to emerge in a very distinctly blood environment. If you're wondering how exactly all of this strangeness came to pass, you will be delighted to discover that there's a fairly exhaustive backstory contained within the readme option in the menu of this mod. It is pretty damn convoluted, so me trying to recount it will probably just give me a nosebleed. All you need to know is the Cabal are the bad guys from Blood. They took over some UAC facilities, opened a portal, and a lot of really strange stuff happened. Hence, this. Another consequence of this mashup is that you have the opportunity to pick between either Doomguy or Caleb at the start of a new campaign, each of which, as you'd imagine, is armed with the signature weapons, and on occasion you'll also stumble across power-ups from each respective game. The kicker being that certain power-ups can only be taken advantage of by the respective character, which unfortunately means no dual-wielding for Doomguy. A criminal omission, if you ask me. If I had to pick the first thing that certainly stood out to me about Bloom, it would be the mapping. This is a really astonishing piece of work when you consider that they've got to make a transition between a Doom-style section of level and a Blood-style section of level without giving the player some kind of visual whiplash. And this is achieved with a sort of hybridization similar to the enemies that you'll be encountering during any given map. Strolling into a recognizably Doom section of level will also be accompanied by a layer of overgrowth and decay, linking it visually back to elements you may associate with Blood, and vice versa. In a more recognizably Blood section, you'll see the creeping influence of the Doom tech base, industrial textures bleeding through the walls. With regards to this opening level, I'd say that it functions as a pretty damn effective introduction to what Bloom is going to be all about going forwards, and it does so in a fashion that manages to avoid being too overwhelming, and that could have very much been the case if it were in lesser hands. Dealing with disparate elements and mashing them together like this could always result in confusion, disorientation, but there's enough of a clear thread of progression between one disparate area and the next to make sure that you've got a pretty clear idea of what you're doing and where you need to be. Another thing worth mentioning, and something that certainly feels much more apparent when you get into the second map, is just how creepy everything feels. This is a mod that has a really good grasp of tone and atmosphere. You're wandering through this thing going, I'm kind of creeped out. I'm kind of worried about what's going to happen next, and I don't really know why. I mean, this section, for example, just lets you roam a third chunk of this map, just taking in the sights, taking in the sounds, before you actually get to something that will trigger some enemies for you to fight. And that amount of restraint I've always struggled with when it comes to mapping in my own right, because I want to get to the action. I don't want to bore people, and I'm always worried that whatever I'm doing is boring. Happily, I can say that is certainly not the case here. This is one of those maps where I could happily just stare at certain sections of it for ages, just trying to figure out how they got it to work that way, how they decided on how they were going to break it apart and stitch it together like that. It's just really goddamn awesome mapping. It really is. And it certainly doesn't hurt that when it does come time to shoot things in the face, that's pretty decent too. The second level, while maintaining its admirable baseline of spookiness, also manages to introduce a mapping gimmick that is quite possibly one of my favorite things about Bloom, and the first instance of it is when you answer this phone. It's not just an ambush, it's also a teleport, an almost seamless teleport that puts you in a completely different section of level. And yes, I know, this is not a new thing, but it is not too often that I get to see it pulled off with quite such aplomb. It is a really, really fun trick to use, and one that continued to put a smile on my face the second, third, and fourth time that I engaged in it during the course of this level, because this encounter shortly after just kept killing me. Eventually, I managed to wind my way out of that particular situation, and when it came time to repeat the level under the guise of Caleb, I found it much easier to tackle, familiarity obviously greasing the wheels of my progression. As it happens, leaving this section is also done via teleport, this time baited by the presence of a megasphere, one that cruelly you don't get to pick up when you actually pass through. Unless you can, and I managed to miss it, which quite frankly would not surprise me at this point. In any case, the mapping continues to impress, largely by virtue of the fact that the level somehow remains legible despite multiple teleports and the occasional need to backtrack. If anything, it just speaks to the strength and intelligence of the construction here. It's the kind of mapping that gives the player the illusion of haphazard exploration, but in reality, there's actually a fairly straightforward critical path threaded throughout. For those of you worrying about a potential lack of combat during the course of this level, fear not. It does pick its moments, and when it does, it really does pile on the enemies, and you get to deal with them in all of the hybridized freakish glory. You got Hellhound Pinkies, you've got Caco-Goyles, you got whatever the unholy heck the Archvile has been merged with, and the interesting thing here is it's not just a cosmetic change that you're looking at, you're also looking at change in behaviors and attacks, and that's most notably apparent with the Caco-Goyle, which can shield itself with its wings and makes dealing with it kind of troublesome if you're not using the right kind of weapon. The next level is set on a train, and I imagine you've got a few preconceptions on how that might typically go. All things considered, the setting of a train is actually kind of restrictive when it comes to designing a level. That is, unless you're playing Bloom. In which case, the interior of the carriages can flat out open up into the void dimension. The first diversion leads us into a dilapidated rendition of Toxic Refinery. This streamlines the level, chopping out a few of the more memorable secret sections, instead giving a little bit of a cursory nod to where they should be. I like how this section also preys on your expectations of how an encounter normally goes. This has the walls drop away, revealing some troublesome cacos, but still reveals that hallway full of zombies hidden in that secret section of wall. The return trip is similarly laden with enemies, having you fight back through the facility, before surprisingly leading you down a path that in the original version of this map would have had you discovering the secret exit. Instead, flicking this switch is vital for progression here, and in my first attempt led to my swift, violent, burning death. These enemies, in particular, I always found a little troublesome to deal with because I wasn't entirely sure which varieties came equipped with a flare gun, and when you do take a hit from the flare gun, good grief does that thing melt through your health. In any case, remember that previous level where I was gushing about that wonderful little teleport gimmick? Well, guess what? Here it is again! You know, at this point I just feel like I'm really easily entertained by relatively simple things. This is the equivalent of dangling keys in front of a baby for a cheap reaction, but it gets me every time. And it pulls the trick multiple times during the map. It's not just that one time, it does it again, like right here. And I love it every single time because it's just so well done. I mean, look, now we're in Dead Simple. How can you not enjoy that? If we're gonna get down to brass tacks here, I'm pretty sure the real reason I enjoy this map so much is because it's a train map that ignores the fact it's on a train. It's just a wonderfully ballsy decision that takes that traditionally tricky design dilemma of a restrictive space on a locomotive and says, screw it! We're in the void dimension, we don't have to worry about shit. Moving on to the next level, you'll find that things don't change at all because this is still a train level. Got him! Got him! They didn't see it coming. Got him! But yeah, fantastic level, wonderful subversion of how the map usually goes, and I gotta be honest, it's probably gonna be a map I will think about for a long time to come. And even then, this is not the final map on the docket. We've got another one left to go. How can they possibly raise the stakes from here? Oh damn, they really went all in on the void aesthetic, didn't they? We've got tilted buildings on floating islands, we've got bits of debris hanging in mid-air. Let's face it, they're just showing off at this point. They're doing this just because they can. I mean, look at this, it spins. That said, this map does not kick off with all of the eye candy. It starts off in much more modest environments, kicking you off in a subway station after disembarking that ill-fated train. And at this point, I'd like to categorically state that this is an objective improvement over the blood spiders. I'd rather they be bigger and more easier to shoot than those tiny little fiddly fucks that you get in typical blood levels. As for the Sharkybus, the man shark. In fact, both of those varieties are present here. Yeah, I can take them or leave them. If there's one enemy I managed to repeatedly butt heads with, however, it's probably gotta be the pain elemental. This is just much more irritating here than I remember it being in vanilla form. Maybe it's the wings, maybe it's the seemingly accelerated rate at which it can spit out pain elementals, maybe it's the fact that it's just a big fat flying turd. Either of these is a equally valid explanation, but I did find that if you're playing as Caleb, the pain elemental utterly melts if you're using the Tesla. No, not that Tesla. Down, Musk. Down! After a short jaunt, this map kicks you out in the city-style section that I was drooling over earlier, and I have to admit, the first time I encountered this, it was accompanied with a slight feeling of trepidation. You see, I've been burnt by city-style maps in the past. More than anything, I typically find it's just a consequence of over-ambition, a few more streets than necessary, a little too convoluted on the internal building design, and certainly repetitive use of urban textures typically doesn't help. But here, that problem is swiftly sidestepped by keeping things simple. Funny how that works, isn't it? I mean, sure, it may look visually complex, but that's actually masking a relatively simple and straightforward layout, one that has redundancies built into it if you decide to stray too far in the wrong direction. For example, if I decided to continue on beyond this tower, there's actually an impassable gap that would turn me around and head me back in this particular direction. After that, it's a simple case of picking up the right key, matching it to the correct door, and you're pretty much off to the races. After flipping a few switches, the map will inform you that you need to head beyond the towers and visit the opposite end of town, whereupon you'll annoy an archvile so much that it pulls off its own friggin' head. Exploring the nearby buildings will give you a batch of enemies to turn to mincemeat, a few skellies to agitate, and a gap to be jumped across. All of this is in service of acquiring a key that will send you back to that opening section and have you unlock the door of the other building on the other side of the street. This one throws a tad more complexity in comparison to the other building in the area by distracting you with more ground-level enemies such as the arachnospiders, while peppering you from above with deviously placed hit-scan enemies. Flipping a switch in that building will point you in the general direction of the impressively named Baron Wolf Temple. You may wonder why it's named in such a fashion, and that's because it's got a Baron Wolf in it.
Of course!
Crossing back over the bridge with my freshly acquired skull key, I now had access to the back end of the map, which does in fact continue a fair bit longer than expected. At this point, by Bloom's own standards, this map was already getting a bit long in the tooth, but no, there was yet more map to be experienced. Welcome to the hospital. Things you will find here include highly flammable members of staff, generously stocked waiting rooms, and of course that old chestnut, statues with archvile hybrids hidden inside of them. All in all, I'd say that this final section of map is really straightforward. It's got a little bit of eye candy smattered around, and largely serves as an enemy gauntlet for you to fight through before you finally reach the exit proper. As far as final encounters go, it's a pretty decent one, offering up a challenging collection of enemies to keep you on your toes and crucially keep you moving and threading your way through these rooms to avoid taking too much direct damage. I mean, sure, it's not a big old blowout ending, but one thing you've got to consider here is that the version of Bloom I have been playing through today is simply the demo version. The 4 maps here in the final version will be accompanied by an additional 4, rounding it up to a full 8-map episode. And I can tell you right now, I am tremendously excited to see what the authors of this have up their sleeves. For those of you out there wondering whether you should take that as a glowing recommendation, yes. Absolutely yes. This is a tremendously well-polished piece of work, one that seemingly came out of absolutely nowhere and has just impressed the heck out of me. Further to what I've covered in this video, if you fancy bringing the hybrid monstrosities of Bloom into other maps, this is also fully compatible with not just Doom 2, but Ultimate Doom, Final Doom, and yes, even Sigil. On top of that, if the ModDB page is to be believed, Bloom also adds traps and random events in original maps, so you can rest assured that's something I'm going to be testing out for myself relatively soon. But until then, if you fancy checking out this version of Bloom for yourself, you'll find the link, as usual, in the description below. While I'm at it, I'd like to give a great big thank you to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon. Thank you so very much for supporting the channel and for helping to make content like this possible. If you're interested in lending a hand yourself, maybe you'd like to see your name in the credits, maybe you'd like to gain early access to my videos before anyone else, heck, maybe you just enjoy the smell of burning money, well, if that's the case, then you'll find a link to my Patreon page, also in the description below. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Feel free to let me know what you thought in the comments, and feel free to suggest any mods you'd like to see me cover in future editions of Doom Mod Madness. This has been Mr. Icarus. Thank you very much for watching. Icarus out.